Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Live from Super Soul Farm, this is Wisdom of the Sages, your daily yoga podcast with your host Raghunath and co-host and senior educator at the Bhakti Center in New York City, Kaustubha. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Sleep In Sunday. It's our brain picking day. We invite guests with a good story and we pick their brains. And we got a very special guest today. We have Moby, also known as Moby. Do we have what's going on? We have weird sounds going on today. Mara, can I blame Mara for that?
Yeah, sorry, probably.
What sort of weird sounds? I'm making tea.
There it is. You're the weird sound, Moby.
I hope that
he's wandering around banging.
I don't think it's that weird. It's water in the background boiling that in about 30 seconds or a minute will stop.
That is pretty weird. Anyway, you're here for Brain Picking Day, and I'm honored to have you. Kaustubha, you want to do the official introduction to Moby?
Sure. Moby is a recording artist who has sold over 20 million records worldwide. He's a singer, a writer, a musician, a producer, and an animal rights activist. His new release is called All Visible Objects. And like with so much of his work, all the proceeds go to environmental causes and animal rights groups. We're very happy to have you here, Moby. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
And Raghunath, you and Moby go way back. Maybe you could share just a bit about that.
I first met Moby when I was 16 years old in Stamford, Connecticut at an underground punk club in the basement of an art gallery where disenfranchised youths like ourselves would gather on weekends because we couldn't relate to the people in our high schools. You know, you can imagine Connecticut. It's Connecticut. I think there's like an archetype of what Connecticut is. And there was a few people that just couldn't fit in the schools. And there was an outlet, and we go to this place on weekends. And that's where I met Moby. And even back then, Moby was considered incredible musician. And, you know, we all respected him as a musician. He was in a band called Vatican Commandos. I was in a band called Violent Children. And he was from Darien. I was from Danbury. And that's where I met Paramananda. That's where a bunch of us met. Good memories, Moby?
What's that?
Was it good memories at the
I mean,
Anthrax
it was phenomenal because, you know, like Raghunath was saying, sorry, I'm pouring tea. Okay, tea is made and now I'm all set. Yeah, it was really, sorry, I'm dark now, moving the tea. Hopefully this makes it a little more exciting.
Yeah,
This is the most unprofessional interview we've done so far. I'm sitting here with makeup and
yeah, it was remarkable because growing up as a disenfranchised kid in Connecticut, you felt this great sense of isolation. You know, because Connecticut was very, like many places, it was very culturally homogenous. It was quite conservative. And when I was growing up, I felt that the only place I could go to find community was New York City. And then we discovered this club, the Anthrax, in Stamford, Connecticut, and it was 10 minutes from my house, and it was filled with other disenfranchised punk rockers. And it felt like magic that you could just travel 10 minutes and suddenly be with all these like-minded, weird, disenfranchised, nerdy punk rock kids. Because I guess also, traditionally when people think of punk rock, they think of maybe mohawks and, you know, tough guys in leather jackets. And we were about as untough as could possibly be. Like we weren't tough punk rockers. We were skinny little nerdy punk rockers.
We were
Or at least
Um,
speaking for myself, I was a skinny little nerdy punk rocker, and most of us were. I mean, like, we didn't even know how to make our hair go up in spikes, even if we had wanted to. So we just looked like computer nerds who liked Black Flag.
That was Murray's pomade, I believe, was the best stuff to get your hair spiked.
We kept trying to figure it out. I mean, like, the things that people did to like try and look cool, and it just never worked.
For me, I had curly hair. I could never spike my hair. I was always sort of let down. So I just had to go with this same haircut I have now. This has been my ongoing haircut since I was 16. And then Kaustubha, of course, we knew Kaustubha. He was also a disenfranchised kid, but from the other side of the river, from Westchester. And we all used to go to this one if you think in retrospect now, these were illegal clubs. They were after hours, opened at midnight, the A7 on the corner of Avenue A and 7th Street, across from a heroin-filled park. And that's where I sort of recognized Kaustubha from immediately. Got to know him much better later. But I will say about Moby, he was not just an impressive music, but you were writing your own musician. He was writing his own music. That just to even be part of that scene, you were an activist, because we questioned the status quo. We questioned clothing and fashion. We questioned diet. That was like the original almost activism. And you had to do it not because it was like everybody was doing it. Matter of fact, you really put your life into your own hands to be that kind of activist, because we grew up in a world of bullying. I know in my high school, it was to make a fashion statement back then, you were risking your life at times.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I remember getting beaten up for wearing a Talking Head shirt. Like walking down the halls of my high school and like wearing a simple little Talking Head shirt was enough to like infuriate people and make them want to punch you in the face. I mean, now I don't even know if anything like that exists. Like if you can get beaten up for wearing a band t-shirt, but back then, I mean, like the culture was so homogenous there.
I hate to think of what would happen if you wore a Dead Kennedy shirt.
Yeah, you probably would have been crucified.
You would have been dead. I had Dead Kennedys painted on the back of my jacket.
That's a level of bravery I couldn't even think of. Like I had to spend like weeks working up my courage to wear a Talking Head shirt to Darien High School.
Darien was extra conservative. It was this whole county where we were from, Westchester, Fairfield County. It's where the multimillionaires of New York City buy their homes when they move outside of New York City. And I think if I know your background, you didn't grow up in that multimillionaire home. You grew up like with a single mom. And
yeah, we grew up poor white trash. My mom just lived there because the schools were good, but we were on food stamps and welfare, which has given me issues that I hold on to this day.
Yeah. We developed some backbone just to make that statement, though. That's for sure. When my kids went to school and they told me, we don't tolerate bullying at our school, I was like, oh, you don't? Man, I missed out. My whole education was like figuring out my space in the pecking order. And when I realized I'm at the bottom of the pecking order, I just decided to not hang out at school anymore and go to New York City and hang out.
Yeah, it's like without bullying, if there are no bullies, why would you ever start a punk rock band?
We had someone to like rebel against.
Yeah.
Being vegan, being not drinking and smoking, that too was an issue to bring that into that community, especially in New York City, which was filled with drugs and which was filled with it was a weird cross between rebellion meets incredible massive indulgence, like unparalleled to anything you saw in suburban high schools. They were doing drugs on the street, huffing glue in bags. And so to even make that statement, I'm going to be vegan or I'm going to be drug free, that was also a big statement to get punished for. And with to speak of anything spiritual, your music, added a lot of, I feel like, especially with Play, your biggest record, but probably in all of them, they had a strong spiritual element. Did you ever get heat for that? Is there a role of spirit in music, or do they feel like it should be? Did you ever get pushback from culture?
I mean, I would
your
say
fans?
that at the risk of sounding a little bit esoteric, by definition, music is spiritual. And I mean that in quite a literal way, because music, and I used to work with Dr. Oliver Sacks. He was a neuroscientist, and he started this thing called the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function that looks at music as an actual healing modality in a very clinical way, like how it affects the endocrine system, how it affects stress hormones, how it promotes neurogenesis. And at one point I realized one of the most interesting things about music is that quite literally and technically, music has never existed. Meaning all that music ever is air molecules moving a little bit differently. You know, so there's nothing physical to music. You know, like a painting, you can touch a painting. A sculpture, you could touch a sculpture. But music is like, whether you're playing guitar or there's a bird or a jackhammer, all these things are pushing air molecules a little bit differently. And so I would say that that's why I think music lends itself to spiritual expression so well, is because by definition, it is just spirit.
I want to say that I know in my own life, my wife, who was a single mom of 2 kids, and everybody who knows a single mom or has been in the position as a single mom, it's like an up a Himalayan mountain peak to deal with. And when I first, I think we met you in 2003 in New York City at Teeny. Was that the name of your cafe? Teeny?
Yeah.
We met you at Teeny that time, and she was so excited because she's like, "You don't understand, Raghu, who Moby is to me. I was going through the hardest time of my life, and that gave me that CD gave me so much spiritual strength to just try to exist unsupported with 2 little babies." And it's amazing the people you touch that you never know you touch as well.
Well, that's one of the amazing things about, music, but any type of, we'll talk like global culture, you know, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a book, whether it's, you know, anything that we do that goes out into the world, once it leaves our hands, we don't know where it's going. We don't know who it's reaching. I mean, there's always a chance that we'll make music or do something and put it out into the world and no one will hear it or respond to it. But then there are those moments when something that you've done reaches someone at a time when they desperately need to be reached, you know, and that is, for me, one of the most powerful, remarkable parts of being a musician is when I meet someone and they tell me that a piece of music that I've made helped them get through something, or that it was played at a loved one's funeral or played at a wedding. And it's just,
I just
amazing.
read that.
What's that?
Someone played your song at their funeral. Did you read that too? Did someone say that personally to you? I just read it. Say, my father just died and we played the song of yours at the funeral.
So I guess I was channeling that. But
you must have channeled that.
It's so humbling and honoring to be involved in, because essentially these are strangers, but to create something intimate that is then finding a place in other people's most intimate lives, it's such a remarkable honor. And it's really like, when people tell me those things, I never quite know how to respond, because I just want to say thank you to them. Like, thank you. And like, thank you for involving me in such an intimate part of your life.
Yeah. Kaustubha, I know you wanted to ask some questions about
Sure.
you know, we've been reading up on 12 steps. A lot of the people on the on the show here, a lot of the regular Zoomers here are in recovery. We even have we're just started this week, a matter of fact, a whole recovery group within this, because we find such parallels to, you know, the teachings of ancient yoga. You want to dive into that, Kaustubha?
Sure. Well, you know, to me, it seems that, you know, although as a kid I did drugs and all that, but when I was quite young, when I was 21, you know, I became a monk and I just left that all behind. So I never went through any serious addiction, although so many of my friends did. And so what I know about the 12 steps, it seems to me that any genuine spiritual tradition is in one way or another trying to do more or less what these steps are kind of outlining. It has to do with coming to a place of humility, coming to a place of faith, and then this practice of, in a sense, like distancing yourself from the ego so you can take a real look at your life, at your past, and kind of clearing that out in some way, coming to terms with that. And then from that place going into, through prayer or meditation, connecting with God in some way. So that it seems to me that these 12 steps, they're not just relevant to people with drug or alcohol addiction, but that to anyone that's looking to find some kind of spiritual growth, more or less a process like that is taking place, whether it's from this tradition or that tradition, or this religion or whatever. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I got sober for real about 12 years ago. I mean, I had started drinking and doing drugs when I was around 9 or 10 years old.
Yeah.
Don't listen to that. My daughter's listening. Just pretend you didn't hear that.
Yeah. And I would stop sporadically. I actually had a funny moment. You were talking about A7. One of the first times I went to A7, I would have been 15 or 16, and I was straight edge, meaning I liked Minor Threat, and I drew an X on the back of my hand.
That's all you needed back then.
And I remember going to A7, and I think it was Dougie from Kraut was tending bar.
Doug Holland.
Yep.
And he was so pissed off that I was straight edge that he like held me down on the bar and with some alcohol like cleaned the X off the back of my hand.
There wasn't a lot of straight edge in New York at that time.
Yeah. And so I had, and then of course I went back out and started drinking and doing drugs and got sober and then went out and went, so, you know, so I had like a revolving door approach to sobriety for quite a long time. And then 12 years ago, I was finally done, you know, and I find that when a lot of people get sober for real, it's when they get to that point of just being done. Like you can't keep doing it anymore. And what's great about that is you go into AA or AA is great, any 12-step program or any program of recovery, and you go in so broken that you're willing to do the work. And, you know, because otherwise, if people's lives are going pretty well, like there's never that desperate compulsion to actually do the work.
Yeah.
You know, and the 12 steps, what I found for me is when you read when you're in a church basement and you see them printed on a piece of paper or vinyl tacked to a wall, they don't make much sense. But when you actually do them, they can really be this remarkable tool for like deep self-understanding and, you know, a sort of daily reminder to be of service and to be humble. And one of the things I agreed with everything you said, and when you were talking about the role of the ego, and I've been wondering about this quite a lot lately, is like, we do tend to understandably malign the ego. You know, we identify the ego, we say that it causes all these problems, but sometimes we forget that, you know, the ego is almost like a self-protective mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I feel like in some spiritual traditions, there's just this knee-jerk response to like get rid of the ego, as opposed to ask the question, like, what role is it serving? And usually, I know for me, it's just coming from a place of fear and insecurity, you know?
Yeah.
And it's masked by drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, etc.
Yeah, all these coping mechanisms, you know, these things that you think you need to function. And it's almost as if God and the universe are saying, like, no, you don't need the, like, you're better than that. Like, you know, like sometimes being broken of coping mechanisms, whether it's materialism, sex, alcohol, drugs, ego, anger, violence, all these things, like the universe is just kind of saying, you don't need them. Like things are like, you're afraid, but really the fear has outlived its usefulness.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know, I really appreciate what you're saying. And when I look at the steps, I look at, like, say the first three, I think they're beautiful meditations or beautiful thoughts. And I can say, okay, those are powerful, you know, admitting that I'm powerless and admitting that there's a greater power, and making a decision that I want to turn my life over. But I also think that, you know, that could be potentially it could be lip service if someone doesn't go too deep into it. But when I look at the fourth step, which says that one has to make a searching and fearless moral inventory of themselves. To me, that sounds like a great one. That sounds like where a lot of work gets done. And I was wondering if you could share with us something about the nature of that challenge, of that moral inventory, fearless moral inventory.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I had been raised by very progressive, my mom and my family were very progressive, and they were hippies, and you know, all my life, like, I voted Democrat, and I, you know, had been a philosophy major. So I thought, even though I was a bottomed out alcoholic and drug addict, I thought that I was relatively self-aware. And so when it came to doing the fourth step, I remember I sat down with my first sponsor, and he said, okay, you need to write down your list of resentments. And I, being an NPR listening progressive, I was like, oh, I don't have any resentments. And he said, well, just start. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, I had like 50 pages of resentments.
Wow.
Right.
And then you go through each resentment and you deconstruct them. You know, like methodically, you deconstruct every resentment that you have, and you look at the role of fear. You look at the, you know, how is the resentment based on fear? How is the resentment selfish? How is it self-seeking? How is it a misrepresentation? And how is it inconsiderate? And it's such a remarkable process to really, like, to take these fears and understand them so much better, and really understand where they're coming from.
What a lot of dredging up that is.
Oh yeah, I mean, and to do it in the presence of another person is so powerful, because you're taking
That's another step, isn't it?
What's that?
What's that?
Step 5.
Step
Yeah,
5, right?
4, 5, 6. Yeah.
Admit it to God, to ourselves, and to another human being. So it's one thing to say, well, I did it to God. But to go to another person, and that probably means the sponsor or a person you feel like is walking their talk, and you share the nature of those wrongs. That's powerful.
Well, especially because it gets super gritty, you know, like stuff that's both disgusting, things that are really embarrassing, things that are incredibly vulnerable, because the resentments can be to yourself, you know, like there are the tough resentments of like, oh yeah, there was the time that like I punched that guy in the face at CB's. Like, sure, that's a tough one. That's an easy one to deal with. But it's the ones where you're like, oh, I slept through my mom's funeral. I, you know, cheated on an ex-girlfriend and broke her heart. Like, these are the ones where you just like, where you feel true shame and sadness, and realizing when you share them with another person that everyone's been there, everyone's done those things. And you create this sense of like solidarity and self-compassion and compassion for others, because the human condition does sort of, you realize it affects everybody.
Yeah,
sure. It's powerful sharing that in a circle, hearing that, because there's a tendency for us to think our problems are unique to me. I'm a wreck. I'm a train wreck. Everybody else, I've seen their Instagram photos. They're all doing fine. Yeah. And when you share that in a circle, you realize, oh, I get it. we're all a bunch of dented cans here.
Well, that's what's funny is when I go to AA meetings or NA meetings or any 12-step meeting, and people come in who are new, and they'll be beating themselves up. They'll be like, "Oh, if only you knew what I had done." And it's like, "Oh, honey, you have no idea. Like,
Oh, honey.
like just get in line. Like whatever you've done, the people in this room have done exactly that, and probably 1,000 times things that are 1,000 times worse."
I see you're philandering, and I raise it criminal activity and robbery.
Yeah. I see your fist fight and raise you mass murder. Yeah.
I appreciate the wisdom in these 12 steps. And I see it so parallel with the yoga path that I've been practicing for over 30 years, in the sense that it's saying you've got to clear out a lot of stuff. You got to clear out a lot of anger, resentment, fear, shame possibly, before you can, and then it mentions later in those steps, meditation, right? That meditation, we can talk about meditation, we could try to practice meditation, but how deep does it go until we do this gritty work that you're describing? Otherwise the mind is always distracted or guarded in some way. There may be some level of dishonesty that's in the way, I feel. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting because I have done a lot of different practices, whether it's different types of therapy. I was a very serious Christian for a while. I was a Taoist for a while because I had a huge crush on a woman who was a Taoist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That can get me into a religion too.
I was an atheist. I was an agnostic. I was a this, I was a that. But I don't want to sound too culty, but for me, doing the 12 steps, it helped me more than any of these other practices, which is not in any way to malign these other practices. I'm just saying, like, there's a practical aspect to the 12 steps because they were cobbled together by bottomed out alcoholics.
Right.
And that's sort of the core of AA, is a program created by bottomed out alcoholics for bottomed out alcoholics, which is why, I don't know if you've ever had that experience where, like, someone will come to me who's not an alcoholic and they'll be very concerned for their friend who's an addict. And I'm like, the only way it'll work is if they talk to other addicts, because there's just an understanding that comes from that. Sure.
And you mentioned about, we spoke about, this importance of revealing your, I believe it uses the term, the nature of your wrongs to another person. And within the practice of bhakti yoga, there is a principle about, it's said that actually this is how yogis share love with one another. And it says one is by giving gifts and receiving gifts. Another is actually by giving food and receiving food. But then, like, the third is, it says that revealing one's mind in confidence and hearing someone share that.
I want to jump in with that too, because, I seriously dabbled in the 12 steps for about 2 years. And that's why a lot of 12-step cliches come out of my mouth occasionally and things like that. But I will say that one great takeaway is that concept of keeping confidential things confidential. And it's an important thing that you can share with someone. And maybe you want to speak about, like, how do you listen? What's a good listen? If I want to share to you, what's a good listener, in your eyes?
I mean, one thing I have to remind myself of, and I have to remind other people of, especially in the 12 steps, is that everybody's insane.
There is no normal.
Like, when you go into AA, or especially, I don't want to speak to other practices, but, like, especially in the 12 steps, like, when you get a sponsor, when you talk to other people, they can be wonderful, but they are also insane. And so sometimes, what you're talking about, this idea of listening, is sometimes you will confide something into someone and they will respond in the worst possible way. Like, they might respond by judging, they might respond by criticizing, they might respond by dismissing, but it forces you to realize, like, okay, humanity is messed up, and we all are capable of great things. We're all capable of terrible things. And so it would be wonderful in a way if every time we confided our secrets to someone, they responded wonderfully. But that it would imply that humanity isn't broken, and humanity is largely broken. So when I'm listening to people, of course, I'm an opinionated egomaniac. So I want to like always be like sharing my thoughts and like telling them what they should do. And, this, and it's so hard, but so helpful. Sometimes you just listen, and rather than tell them what to do, and rather than, give them constructive criticism, you just tell your own story. Or you just simply, the power of simply saying, oh, yeah, that happened. I did that as well. Like, yep, I understand what you're saying. Like, just that compassionate understanding can be just so powerful.
And maybe they've never shared it with anybody until they met you. And you're giving them the ability where like, oh man, if I tell this to anyone, they're going to think I'm crazy. They're going to think I'm sick. They're going to think I'm a psycho. And by giving them that space just to speak, it could be a first time for them to empty their cup.
And to take the things that we're ashamed of, like that power of shame. I had it, I still have it, but like something about taking the things that you're ashamed of and shedding putting the light of day on them and sharing them with another person, and realizing that other person has done the same shameful stuff. It's really liberating when you can be free, largely free of shame, which doesn't mean you should go out and do shameful things. It's not like, I guess, going to confession where you confess to doing something bad with the understanding you're going to go back out and do it again. Like, the idea is like you confess and you like share the things you're ashamed of, with the idea that now you don't need to go out and do those terrible, shameful things anymore.
Moby, that place where you go, that magic spot where you're like, I can't go on like this anymore. I thought I was smart. I thought I had my act together. I thought I had perfect plans, and I'm realizing that my so-called genius has brought me to this desperate place. It's like a beautiful desperation. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine for you, because the ego always wants to say, I'm the center, I'm the coolest, I'm the, and especially when you're getting the whole world to endorse you, like I can't imagine what 20 million sales are. I can't even imagine that. I mean, I had some fame, but it was like little tiny fame, and you had like this mega fame. And I can understand that fuels everything the devil wants. You know what I mean? You're the best, you're the coolest, and to come down to your knees like that, it's actually a beautiful state, because it's like a threshold to God, so to speak. Don't you think we're at a threshold right now? It's like, I'm scared to even look at the CNN or Fox News. I'm scared to open up any news app, because there's so much polarization and hate. And it's saddening. Tell me, Moby, what should we do? We're all at our knees right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what the word inflection means, but people keep talking about an inflection point. And I mean, the thing that scares me is a lot scares me, but what really scares me is sometimes that what you were talking about, that, and it's funny because, in AA and 12 steps, people love acronyms. Like, and there's some really good ones. One of my favorites is, for fear, is false evidence appearing real.
HALT, hungry, what is it? It's HALT.
Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. But
Yes.
One of the best acronyms is for God, which is gift of desperation.
I like it.
But you're right, that one of the things I'm most grateful for in my life is the thing that I hated the most when I was going through it, which was that, you know, those years of, on the outside, things looked okay. But on the inside, you know, like I was drinking, I was doing drugs, I was going on tour, I was being promiscuous, I was selling records, but I was also trying to kill myself. I was despairing. I was trying different types of therapy. I was battling panic attacks and addiction. So like when I came to that point of true desperation, I hated it. I just wanted to like keep living in the world of degeneracy and narcissism. I didn't want to change, but you know, not to anthropomorphize the universe too much, but the universe was like, no, you need to change. Even though it's going to be painful, you have to change. And what I fear is that sometimes people don't get to that point, and sometimes they do, but they still die. You know, like I know a lot, as we all do, I'm sure we know a lot of addicts who get to that point of desperation, but they're so damaged, they still die. You know, so like they try to get sober and maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't happen, but they've hurt themselves too much, so they die. And I'm just wondering, like, as a species, as a culture, are we going to be able to get to this point of desperation and move forward and be healed, or are we going to die?
Yeah.
And
it's
I don't know.
Yeah, it's like the world is one big addict right now, and we're close to hitting that rock bottom. And you know, it's our own greed and exploitation that has dehumanized us in so many ways. And as a society, we're kind of facing the consequence, just like I suppose an addict faces the consequences of their addiction, that we're facing the consequences of our dehumanization in the form of climate change, in the form of global pandemics, and as we speak, in the form of violence in our streets of America, you know, in response to institutionalized racism. And I wanted to bring up one of your works that you, a few years back, you released a song with an animated video.
That was a great video.
Are You Lost in the World Like Me? Which I felt in a very creative way.
Mara, can you dig that up and put it on the board, please?
I felt that like in a very creative way, it illustrated our dehumanized state, you know, of the world. And could you speak a bit about that song and that video?
Yeah, well, the video is made by this animator named Steve Cutts.
Yeah.
And he made a cartoon that I had seen. I think it's called Life or Man. And it was the most remarkable thing I've ever seen. In fact, I'm going to look it up just so I can tell you what it's actually called. Okay. Because it's almost worth watching that more so than the video he made for me. But I saw this.
You can put it on the chat board, Moby. We'll steal it from
I don't know how to do that. That's way too
sophisticated. You're like the technological genius.
It's called his video that I saw was called Man. Easy to remember, MAN. And it was it's
his name again was
Steve Cutts. Steve STEVE Okay. The video is called Man. And I saw that and I asked him to make a video for me, and we talked about, because I feel like if you're gonna put art or music or culture out into the world, like at the very least, don't waste people's time. And at the best, try and make something, and it sounds so presumptuous, but you try and make something that speaks to issues or that will, I mean, it's presumptuous, but will help people. I mean, obviously, like, like Shelter and Youth of Today were perfect examples of that. I mean, even so, like I saw you guys play recently at Zebulon, and it's like, you realize, like I was looking at the audience and I was like, of course they love the music, they love you guys, but it's the integrity of it and the fact that you guys used your voices to address issues and try and make the world a better place. And
it was uncool, Moby. It was very uncool.
I mean, yeah, which is funny because, like, that is, again, like the punk, when people think of punk rock, a lot of times they think of nihilism, they think of destruction, they think of, you know, just like broken beer bottles. But like, I think what appealed to us about punk rock was like, it was idealistic. You know,
Sure.
it dealt with politics. I mean, from the Clash to Minor Threat to every, you know, to Youth of Today to the Bad Brains, you know, Gorilla Biscuits, on and on and on, like all these bands who are really idealistic, you know. And so the music might have sounded like buildings being exploded, but the lyrics oftentimes, you know, were really like powerful and uplifting. And so I've tried in my own small way at times to hold on to that spirit in the work that I do, you know, because I was so inspired by, you know, by Youth of Today, by, you know, that idea of like, if you're going to make something, be an activist in all that you do, or at least try to be.
Yeah.
You've done it, man.
Well, you've done it.
It's amazing what you're doing. And you're doing it on such a massive level. It's so impressive. And I got a feeling like after you hit that rock bottom, after you work those steps, then what else is there? I mean, I think probably between addiction, which is the gift and the threshold, and then the sort of like peeling off the layers of ego, then all you're really left with is a state of like, it's just about giving back to the world, or giving back to spirit, or seeing spirit in everybody. And I feel like you're doing it with what you're doing now. Truthfully, I'm very impressed, man. I have to say, I'm honored to call you my friend after all these years.
Well, thanks. Right back at you. I mean, it is that terrifying place of, you know, we grow up with certain assumptions, or at least I grew up with certain assumptions, I assume we all did, that if we had the right sort of portfolio of stuff, that we would be happy. You know, like if the right portfolio of, you know, fame, money, materialism, adulation, etc. And obviously, like, I was broken of that, not by my own choice, like the universe or whatever broke me of that and dragged me kicking and screaming away from all those beliefs. But then you're left in this weird place where everything you thought should work hasn't worked, but you don't know what to do. And I think that's why so many people relapse, and so many people like hold on to bad behavior, whether it's addiction or materialism or terrible relationships or just like unhealthy thoughts. Like, it's so much easier to hold on to the negative and the familiar rather than move into the unknown and the unfamiliar.
As far as the video, and as far as just like recognize, I mean, it's one thing to like recognize what's going on out there. It's like we're having lunch. I remember when it first started. Sitting with friends. And this was before I had the ability to text anybody. And I was sitting with friends and we were having lunch and they were texting. Now that's very normal. But I remember when I first saw it, that here we are with 4 of us and 3 of them were texting other people, but not talking to each other. And now that really weird situation has become so normalized to the point where I was saying yesterday, I'm checking the weather 5 times. I'm checking, did I get some validation on this? How do we disengage from the insanity? Because we made insanity normal.
Yeah, I mean, I had this experience before the pandemic. I took myself out to lunch in LA, and normally I was by myself. So normally, like, if you go out to lunch by yourself, you just want to like play with your phone the entire time. Right. And I gave myself a challenge, and it disturbed me how painful it was. I was like, okay, for the entire time I'm here, I'm not going to look at my phone. Like, I'm just going to sit. And I'm just going to sit and be present. And it ended up being so fascinating because I realized everybody around me was on their phones, understandably. And I'm not judging because I too am addicted to mine. But I had this small realization. I was like, isn't this interesting? Like, there's a tree that everyone's ignoring so that they can look at pictures of a tree on their phone. I was like, there's a full 3-dimensional tree 20 feet right there. And if you say to someone, hey, look at that tree, they'll ignore you. But if you send them a picture of the tree on their crappy little phone, they'll comment on it and get super involved. And I was like, what's happened that, you know, like what comes at us on a tiny screen has taken precedence over 3D physical reality? Like, what that says about us as a species is kind of mind-boggling.
You know, the yogis say, you know, there's Maya or illusion. And I'm thinking like, the whole world is already Maya. We've created a second Maya. It's like double illusion. Not only is this fake, not connected to spirit, but now I'm creating a whole second illusion to live within. Mm-hmm. And I think we just miss out on like personal relations again. And how do you deal with Kaustubha?
You're talking about the dream within the dream, right? Somehow
the dream within the video game within the video game. Yeah,
it's like Maya's VIP room.
Yeah. Goes deeper and deeper into the inner chambers of it all.
Of the Fibonacci spiral of illusions, perhaps.
Raghunath always likes to break out the Fibonacci spiral, but I don't think either of us really know what it means.
It's like a snail shell. It goes, and they're all concentric circles moving outward. It happens on the micro and the macro. Come on.
Okay. But you know, you talk about looking at a tree. You know, it's like actually there's a lot to learn by looking at that tree if we slow it down. You know, a lot to learn about life, a lot to learn about ourselves, a lot to learn about the world we live in, and you know, the books that we read. You know, our podcast is really a study of yoga literature, like we do it every morning with everyone here, and those books, although they're many centuries old, they were pointing out, you know, the problems with this kind of dehumanization and pointing in certain places where we need to be aware. For instance, especially in how we treat animals and how we treat nature and how we treat each other. So there's a key in spiritual life, you know, to recognize the sacredness in all life. Mm-hmm. And I know that in your own life, that that activism, particularly in the realms of animal rights, as well as in, you know, ecological issues, that they've become very important, you become very active in. And so I myself, you know, I'm just getting to know you, but seeing it from a distance, I see this pattern of, you know, of what materialism can do and where it can bring one, and how through a spiritual process one can rise out of it, and how a practice of yoga that's, you could call it karma yoga, where one is serving selflessly for a higher cause, how that can sustain one. And so I would be curious just to hear you speak a bit about how your work as an activist sustains you spiritually, and specifically how it is that these particular issues became so dear or so important to you.
Well, part of it is the role of evidence. And what I mean by that is, like, it's sort of what we're talking about regarding our culture, is this unwillingness to actually look at evidence. And what I mean by that is, like, I was at a birthday party in New York about 14 years ago, and it was some billionaire's birthday party. And I don't know how I got invited to it. I think I was friend of a friend of a friend. And they had rented this huge venue, the Hammerstein Ballroom. And they had Earth, Wind, and Fire playing. And there were 100 people there in a venue that held 3,000 people. So it was sad. I mean, it was empty, but Trump was there.
I played those shows.
Like Mike Bloomberg was there. Trump was there. All, you know, like, it was this gathering of billionaires. And it was one of the saddest things I'd ever been to. And everyone there was just unhappy. Like, no one was laughing. No one was smiling. It was miserable. And I just started thinking, like, okay, so these are the people for whom materialism has worked out flawlessly. They're all billionaires, and they're miserable. Why do they keep doing it? You know, it's that unwillingness to look at evidence. And that's one of the, we keep coming back to this, but like, it's one of the things I'm so grateful for is that the evidence confronted me personally that my materialism, my narcissism, my ego, my selfishness weren't working. Like they were making, you know, if they were leading to suicide attempts and misery, so clearly they were not working. So I had to figure out something else that did seem to work. And for me, it's just, and I hate, these words are overused, but like it's spirituality, service, and activism. Mm-hmm. And in a way, like I personally don't see a nobility in those things because they just make more sense.
The humanity,
like I had this epiphany when I first moved to LA. I had planted a bunch of trees at my house, and I was reading some magazine sitting by these new trees. And in the magazine, they had an ad for a Rolex watch. And the Rolex watch was like a $10,000 stupid watch. And I had this moment where I was looking at the picture of the Rolex watch for $10,000 and the tree that had cost me $30. And I thought, okay, that tree is going to be alive for 100 years. It's going to grow to be 100 feet tall. It's going to turn CO2 into oxygen. It's going to cool the air. It, you know, creates moisture. It provides homes for millions of creatures, and it's alive, and it's $30, and no one cares. But a Rolex watch is dead, sits on your wrist and tells time worse than like a cheap Casio or your phone, and it's $10,000, and people will kill for it. And I was like, what the hell is going on? Like when we value things that don't work more than things that do, when we value the stupid more than the wise, when we value the unnecessary more than the necessary, it's, I mean, assuming there are future generations, they're just going to look back at us and be like, what were you doing? What were you thinking? Like, how did you value the dead more than the living? How did you value the unnecessary more than the necessary? How did you value death more than life? You know, like it's mind-boggling.
That was beautiful and right on, I feel. And it's right in front of us, and you can choose it whenever you want it. Here's what I'm fearful about, and I'm curious to know how you deal with it. Because I think you probably deal with it pretty well. There's horrible things going on in the food industry, in the treating of the earth, in race relations, in the hierarchy of racism. And it just makes me lose it. It makes me lose my cool. And I get angry, and it turns to, then of course there's the political divide, and where it's like I feel like we're about to have a revolutionary war. I mean, a civil war. How do you deal with loving thy neighbor and not just hating? When you see people mistreat animals, how do you deal with not hating them? And I'm sure you've seen those animal rights activists that are filled with a lot of hate. You see Democrats or Republicans that just have a lot of hate. Right now, this whole thing, with this horrible thing they've done with the killing of this man, it's bringing up actually a lot of hate. What do you do with that? How do you process this as a spiritual-minded person, yet you want change? How are we not being tricked? Because it just seems everybody hates everybody, and it's actually getting scary.
I mean, it's especially hard, you know, because I've been a vegan now for 33 years. Is that right? 33 years. And really, like, when I look at, you know, what humans do to animals, you know, the fact that 100 billion animals will be killed by and for humans this year, you know, and you can't process that. Like, the unnecessary suffering and murder of one being is enough to make my brain explode. But you know, look at that on like such a mass scale. And we're broken. We're a scared, broken species. And so that question you're asking is really the crux of it. Like, how do we move past tribalism and anger and hatred? Because the tribalism and the anger and the hatred seem justified. You know, when I'm in the middle of my anger, it seems righteous and it seems justified. And I think to this one small moment that I had once, and it was a really beautiful shift. I was driving, you guys have driven on the 10, right? You know,
oh yeah.
So I was driving on the 10.
LA to Jacksonville.
Yeah, the ugliest road. And I was driving on the 10 from LA down to Palm Springs for whatever stupid reason. And it was one of those disgusting days, like 95 degrees, the sky, the color of spoiled milk, and like just traffic. And so I'm stuck in traffic. It's super hot. I looked around me and everything is just like beige, terrible. Everything was gross.
Right.
And I was so mad at the other people, like the people who were who were causing this traffic. And then all of a sudden I realized, like, oh, they hate this too. Like they're having their own subjective experience, and it's probably worse than mine. And it's just, but it's that recognition that, like, you know, whatever negative thing I'm experiencing, someone else is experiencing. And largely it's a product of confusion and fear. And, you know, we know how to deal with that when it's a 3-year-old. You know, like if I'm at someone's house and their 3-year-old is angry and screaming and yelling that it hates me and throwing stuff at me, I clearly am not going to walk over and punch the 3-year-old in the face and say, like, you know, fuck you, 3-year-old, you're wrong. Like, how dare you be a Trump supporter? You know, like with the 3-year-old, we know what to do. We comfort them and we recognize that their suffering and their anger are temporary and are usually just the product of like exhaustion and fear. And so it's that question, how do we do that for the people we hate on social media? How do we do that for the people who are, you know, the racist cops, the whomever, like, and I don't know. I mean, I would say that's arguably our biggest challenge. Like, how do we create love and compassion for all living things? Because without that, we're doomed.
There's a lot of cop hate right now. And I know, and it stinks because I know some incredible cops who've given their life to become cops. And there's cop hate. They just want to hate cops. And I feel like when I see that, I feel like we've been tricked. We've been tricked into hating again. And hate is hate. And it stinks to be on the other side of it. I don't want to become hateful. That's my biggest fear, is just to be this hateful person. And whether it's far right or far left, it's still hate. And everybody's right. They're absolutely right. And that's where, and we're not finding any commonality with anything.
There's one thing I try to remember, and this can be challenging, especially to my friends. And so I'm hesitant to say this, but it's something that I try to do, is to understand how much of my worldview is informed by a screen. You know, like, I think that screens are important. Information is important, but it's worth remembering, like, if I'm in front of my TV and I'm angry, or if I'm on my phone and I'm angry, I'm getting angry at a screen. You know, it's pixels and digitized sound. Like, I'm getting angry at information. And I think for me personally, it's very important to balance that with reality, to balance that with in-person friendships and with nature and with my own physical existence, because we can't let our sense of self and our sense of humanity and our sense of the world be hijacked by screens. You know, screen, which I love my screen, but it's a screen. It's not real. You know, like, I know that you guys are real somewhere, I assume, unless this is the Truman Show. But
I live on a screen. I'm a screen.
yeah.
The old Ray
like,
you used to know died.
Like, I remember one time I was walking through my neighborhood, and I don't know anything about sports. Like, because I don't know if you had this experience, but like growing up as a punk rock kid in Connecticut, the choice was either like sports or music. And I was just like, well, I'm little and I suck at sports anyway, so I guess I'll choose music. I love music and sports scares me. So I don't know.
It was sports or drugs. That's what, those were the two options in my school. And the punks were like this tiny 0.5%, not even.
Yeah. And I wasn't smart enough for computers. So I was like, okay, I'll be a punk rocker. But I had this experience. I was walking through my neighborhood and I saw a bunch of people through a window standing in front of a TV screaming. And I was like, what in the world? I couldn't even see what was on the TV. I could just see these people screaming. It turns out it was the Super Bowl, but because I don't know sports, I didn't know that I don't know when the Super Bowl is. And I just thought, I had this moment of clarity, and I had this moment of aliens coming down and being like, why are those people standing in front of a metal and plastic box screaming at pixels? Like, they don't know the athletes. They're not there. They're in a living room in Los Angeles. Why are they screaming at pixels? And like it's that question we have to ask ourselves. Why are we letting ourselves be hijacked by pixels? You know, when reality is everywhere. Reality is everywhere. And reality tends to be kind of calm. You know, reality is the squirrel outside my door who's just doing squirrel stuff, you know? And so I think for me personally, it's important to be educated. It's important to be aware of what's going on, but to remember pixels are pixels. Pixels are not, you know, plants and friends and dogs and squirrels and food and reality.
I'm going to be on the lookout for that squirrel stuff today.
Yeah, squirrels are insane. I mean, like, I got to say, the squirrels in my backyard are way more entertaining than anything I've seen on TV or my phone for a long time. Even
the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Moby, I want to thank you for coming. You're an inspiration with what you do.
Thank you so much.
Glad to call you my friend. And you shed a lot of light and vulnerability. And I think that's one of the great qualifications that make you so successful in what you do. You're very honest. Thank you. We end our show. This sounds ridiculous, but we really do this, Moby. All the Zoomers, I crank some music, which are performed by some friends of ours. And everybody
becomes a DJ.
Look around the board. And everybody, I become a DJ now. And then we all sort of clap and sing. But really want to thank you for coming in, Kaustubha. I just like being with you, Kaustubha, too. It's nice.
I like being with you.
I hope you join us soon. The name of your new record is?
All Visible Objects.
All Visible Objects. And all proceeds going to these incredible foundations for animal protection, the earth protection, and again, impressive, noble causes. Mara, thanks for all your assistance. Thanks for everybody on Zoom for joining us. An interview we did earlier with Moby last year is going to be on our Patreon account for that Tom's editing for all our Patreon members, and more stuff coming up this week on Patreon. Thanks, everybody. If you'd like to support what we're doing, it's patreon.com/wisdom of the sages.
And today's the first 12-step meeting for our Patreon people.
Yeah,
headed up by Jiva.
Headed up by Jiva, who's also an old school A7 girl from the Lower East Side of New York.
Mm-hmm.
Every day, Moby. Every day, 5 a.m. This is me.